The morning coffee steamed on the dark wooden table, while Clara reviewed her agenda with the same precision with which she analyzed the minds of her patients. She was a renowned psychologist in Madrid, specialized in interpersonal relationships and personal development. Her office was full of people looking for answers, and she had the gift of finding them. But there was an uncomfortable truth that he never admitted out loud. When it came to his own life, the answers weren't so clear. The echo of their last breakup still resonated in his mind. The scene was familiar, a cold goodbye, a feeling of emptiness, and the inevitable question, why do I always end up like this? This time it had been Javier, a brilliant but emotionally unavailable man, just like the others before him. Before walking out the door, he had told her something that had stuck in her chest. You always look for men who can't love you, don't you realize? Clara had looked at him in disbelief, ready to argue that he was the problem, not her. But something in his tone, in the confidence of his words, left her without an answer. What if he was right? That night, upon arriving at his minimalist apartment, he plopped down on the couch, looking at the reflection of the city through the windows. At first glance, his life was a success. He had prestige, independence, intelligence. So why, with everything he knew about the human mind, couldn't he decipher his own patterns? He took out his notebook and started writing a list of all his past relationships. Distant, busy, emotionally closed men. Never someone really available. It was as if her heart had a faulty compass that always guided her towards the impossible. But where did that compass come from? She looked up at a photograph on the shelf. Her 7 years old, sitting on a park bench next to her father. A serious man, absorbed in a book, while she looked at him, hoping he would look up. Always waiting. A lump formed in his throat. Was it possible that he was repeating the same story over and over again? That thought accompanied her all week. In his sessions with patients, he began to notice similar patterns in their stories. Women who chose men who made them feel small. Men who fell in love with women who rejected them. People who sabotaged what they wanted most. One afternoon, while checking his email, an invitation caught his attention. A lecture on Carl Jung and the psychology of the unconscious. Something about that title bothered her. He knew who Jung was, he had read about his theories, but at that moment he felt that there was something deeper that he had to discover. Without thinking too much, he confirmed his attendance. Maybe there he would find some answers. The air was charged with Madrid's humidity, that mixture of distant rain and hot asphalt that permeated the city at dusk. Clara was walking around her apartment with her cup of tea in her hand, absent-mindedly leafing through an old notebook. It was a habit he'd had since college, writing about his relationships, as if by putting his emotions on paper, he could understand them better. That night, however, the words seemed to scream at him something he had always ignored. One by one, he reviewed the names of his ex-partners, stopping at details that had previously seemed insignificant to him. Brilliant, intelligent men, passionate about their work, but unattainable in love. Some were too busy to commit, others carried wounds that kept them at a distance. And everyone, without exception, had ended up leaving. Why did it always end up in the same place? He closed his eyes and let his mind travel to the past. He remembered Javier, the last one on the list, but also Martin, the writer obsessed with his career, Daniel, the businessman who said that love was a distraction, and Victor, the artist who always had one foot outside the relationship. They all shared something in common, the inability to give themselves completely. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. He stood up with a sudden impulse and took out another notebook. An older one, with notes from his first therapy sessions during college. There was a sentence underlined in red ink. We look for in others what we have not integrated in ourselves. He stared at those words as if they were speaking directly to him. What if it wasn't bad luck? What if she herself, unconsciously, was looking for something in those men. The sound of a notification on her phone brought her out of her thoughts. It was an email from her colleague Anna, recommending a conference that, according to her, would blow her mind. Title: The Unconscious in Love and Success, Jung's Psychology in Human Relationships. He felt a chill. He had read about Jung in college, but at the time he had found his theories too abstract. However, something inside told him that he had to attend. Could there be something in her unconscious that was causing her to repeat this cycle? He closed the notebook and took a deep breath. Maybe he was about to discover something that would change his life. The auditorium was in darkness, illuminated only by the dim light of the side lamps and the projection on the stage. Clara took a seat in one of the last rows, with the conference program in her hands. He looked around. A varied audience had come. Therapists, psychology students, curious people in search of answers. In the center of the stage, a man with gray hair and piercing eyes adjusted his glasses before speaking. His voice, slow and deep, glided through the room with the cadence of someone who has dedicated his life to understanding what most fear to face. Love is not what we think it is. We like to think that we choose our partners by affinity, by shared values, by destiny, even. But the reality is much more disturbing. Our partners are the mirror of our unconscious. Clara felt a pang in her chest. He shifted in his seat. The man on stage, the Dr. Valera, a renowned psychoanalyst specializing in the work of Carl Jung, walked slowly back and forth, letting his words settle in the minds of the audience. When we fall in love, we do not see the other as they really are. We see what our unconscious projects onto them. And if we follow the thread of those projections, we will find traces of our childhood, of our unresolved wounds, of aspects of our psyche that we have repressed. Clara felt her breathing slow down. Was he saying that we don't consciously choose our partners? The problem is that the unconscious does not look for what is good for us. It looks for what is familiar. Clara remembered her list of relationships. Distant, inaccessible men. Men like his father. We fall in love with what is familiar to us, not with what is good for us. And so, we repeat and repeat the same pattern without understanding why. Some people in the audience were taking hasty notes. Clara, on the other hand, couldn't move a single muscle. She felt like every word was directed at her. Dr. Valera stopped, looked at the audience and dropped one last sentence before changing the subject. If you want to understand your love life, don't look at your partners. Look at yourself. They are just the reflection of your shadow. Clara felt dizzy in her stomach. At the end of the conference, he decided to stay for a few minutes. As the attendees dispersed, he slowly walked towards the stage. I wasn't sure what to tell Dr. Valera. I just knew I had to talk to him. The man looked at her with a calm expression, as if he already knew what she was coming to ask him. How can I stop repeating the same pattern? Clara asked, feeling her voice tremble slightly. The doctor watched her with interest, but instead of giving her an immediate answer, he smiled slightly. First, you have to understand why you repeat it. Because if there is one thing that is certain, it is that it is not a coincidence. Your unconscious is telling you something. Clara felt a chill. Something told him that this conversation was the beginning of a journey from which there would be no turning back. That night, Clara woke up feeling like she was trapped in a labyrinth. His breathing was labored, cold sweat ran down his back. The dream had been so vivid that for a moment she didn't know if she was still asleep or awake. He tried to calm down. He ran a hand over his face and looked at his watch. 3:17 It had been a strange dream. He remembered being in a long hallway full of doors, all closed. She walked barefoot, with the feeling that someone was watching her. Finally, a door opened by itself, and upon entering, he found himself in his father's office. Everything was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood. The stacked books, the smell of tobacco, the dim light of the desk lamp. And there he was, sitting in his big leather chair, With the same serious expression as always, he wasn't looking at her, but was flipping through a book with disinterest. She came closer and tried to talk to him, but no sound came out of her mouth. Her father continued to ignore her, but suddenly, the man looked up. And it wasn't his father. Era Javier, his last partner. Clara woke up at that moment. What did that mean? He sat up slowly, trying to process the strange feeling of anguish the dream had left him with. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, resting his elbows on the counter. His mind kept revolving around the image of his father, and the way his face had transformed into Javier's. What if deep down, all the men she had chosen had something in common with her father? He returned to his room, but instead of sleeping, he took out his notebook and began to write. He let the memories flow without filters. His childhood, his relationship with his father, their partners. His father was sitting on the other side of the table, with a book in one hand and a coffee in the other. She was talking excitedly about a drawing she had made at school, but he barely nodded, staring at the pages. Look, Dad, I made it for you. Finally, he would look up, observe the drawing for a few seconds, and then say in a neutral voice, not bad. Although you could improve the lines. And then I went back to the book. Her friends had already left, but she was still there, with her backpack clutched to her chest. Her mother used to pick her up, but she couldn't that day. His father had promised him that he would do it in his place. The sky was beginning to darken when he finally saw his car pull up to the curb. Clara went up in silence. Sorry, I ran out of time in the office. Her father barely looked at her as he turned on the radio. To him, it seemed like a simple oversight. For her, it was further confirmation of what she already knew. It was never his priority. She felt something inside her break. It was obvious. She had spent years seeking validation from her father in every man she chose. She always chose distant, emotionally unavailable men, because deep down she was still that girl who waited for her father to finally see her. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling the weight of that revelation. Dr. Valera was right. Their couples were no coincidence. They were the reflection of his shadow, and for the first time, Clara asked herself, how do you stop loving a ghost? Dr. Valera's words continued to resonate in Clara's mind like a persistent echo. Your love choices are a reflection of your own shadow. Since that night, something inside her had been activated. It was as if he had finally opened a door to an unknown territory, one where every past relationship, every rejection, and every inexplicable attraction took on new meaning. Sitting at her desk with her laptop on, Clara typed tirelessly. Carl Jung, Deep Psychology, The Collective Unconscious. All of this sounded familiar to him from his university days, but now it had a different urgency. I was looking for answers. Then she found something that left her cold. Anima, in the psyche of man, it is the unconscious image of the feminine. It represents your connection with intuition, emotions, and the inner world. Soul, in the woman's psyche, it is the unconscious image of the masculine. It represents strength, reason, direction, and the ability to make decisions. Clara leaned over the screen, reading with a frown. The animus in a woman is the image of the man that she has internalized throughout her life. It is not only her idea of love, but the masculine energy that lives within her. His mind immediately went back to his childhood. His father. Of his animus was the internal image of the masculine. Then his animus was his father. Suddenly he understood everything. She wasn't just looking for a man, he was looking for his animus. But his animus was wounded. That afternoon, Clara called Dr. Valera. He couldn't help it. Tell me the truth. Is this what is happening to me? The man listened to her in silence with his usual calm. They were sitting in a quiet cafe, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Clara had a notebook full of notes and highlights. Finally, Dr. Valera put his coffee cup on the saucer and looked at her calmly. You have found the root of your problem, but it is not enough to understand it. Now you have to face it. Clara licked her lips. If the animus is the unconscious image of the masculine ... and mine is my father, that means I'm trapped in his shadow, right? The doctor nodded. Your animus is wounded. Instead of pushing you forward with strength and confidence, it has left you trapped in the search for something unattainable. But the animus also has another side. If you heal it, it becomes your greatest ally. It is what gives you power, determination, direction in life. It is not about finding a different man. It is about healing your own animus. Clara remained silent, feeling the weight of his words. For the first time in his life, he understood that it was not an external problem. It wasn't about changing partners or avoiding certain types of men. It was about changing something inside her. He closed the notebook with determination. How do you heal an injured animus? Dr. Valera smiled, getting ready to meet him face to face. Clara looked at herself in the reflection of her apartment window, with the city illuminated behind her. In his mind, Dr. Valera's words continued to echo. You're not looking for a man. You're looking for your own animus, but he's hurt. What did that really mean? He had spent the whole night thinking about it. If his animus was the internal image of the masculine and was based on his father, then didn't that mean he had been idealizing something unattainable all his life? He closed his eyes and a memory emerged without him calling it. Clara, 10 years old, watched her mother from the kitchen door. Her mother was talking on the phone with a friend, with a sweet, nostalgic smile on her face. Fernando is not a man of many words, but deep down he is good. It's just that sometimes he is too busy with work. Clara frowned. He knew that his father was almost never home. And when he was, he spent more time with his books than with them. He knew that his mother suffered in silence, waiting for something from him that never came, but still he talked about him as if he were a silent hero. He loves me, he just has a hard time showing it. An excuse. He opened his eyes suddenly. There was the root of everything. He had not only inherited his father's emotional distance. I had also learned to idealize to men, just as her mother did. To justify their absences. To believe that, deep down, they were good. They just didn't know how to show it. How many times had he repeated the same phrases? He's not bad, he just has a hard time committing. He's afraid of falling in love, but deep down he loves me. If only he could open up more, everything would be different. Excuses, lies disguised as hope. Clara felt a lump in her throat. He had spent his life searching for a love that was never really there. He got up and walked to the mirror. He looked into each other's eyes, and for the first time, the most difficult question of all was asked. How much of what I seek and love is really mine, and how much is a projection? The problem wasn't the men she chose. The problem was the story she told herself about love, and that story had to change. She had promised herself that this time she would do things differently, that it wouldn't fall into the same pattern, that she would never again choose an emotionally distant man, lost in his own worlds. That's why, when her coworker told her about Javier, another Javier, not her ex, she was curious. He is an incredible man. Clara, psychologist, he gives talks on emotional intelligence. He is a great conversationalist. And the best. Her friend smiled. He doesn't play the usual little games. Clara accepted the appointment. They were in a cozy restaurant, with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. Javier was exactly what she always said she wanted in a man: attentive, sincere, open. Tell me more about yourself. Clara. There was something in his voice that disarmed her. He was warm, present, looking at her with genuine interest. There wasn't that air of mystery or remoteness that had always attracted her in other men. But instead of feeling excited, she felt uncomfortable. Because as he spoke, her mind began to wander. She was bothered by the way he held the fork. The tone of his voice seemed too soft, He found it strange how much he smiled. An irrational thought crossed his mind. There is no spark. I don't feel that magnetism. I'm not attracted to him enough. And with that thought, she began to sabotage herself. Excuse me, I have to go. To the bathroom for a moment. He looked in the mirror. His heart was beating hard, but not with excitement. It was anxiety, because this man was not doing anything wrong. On the contrary, he didn't ignore her, he didn't play with her mind, he didn't make her feel insufficient. And yet, I wanted to run away. Why was his mind rejecting the very thing he said he wanted? Your unconscious does not look for what is good for you, but for what is familiar. Familiar. Suddenly, everything made sense. He returned to the table. With a practiced smile, Javier continued speaking to him with the same tenderness. But Clara already knew what she would do. In the following days, he stopped responding to her messages. He excused himself from work. Finally, when he insisted on seeing her again, she wrote, "You're an amazing man, but I don't think we're on the same page." Javier was kind. He didn't pressure her. He only wished him the best. And when Clara closed the chat, she felt a pang in her chest. He had fled. He plopped down on the couch, his mind racing. She had spent years complaining about emotionally unavailable men, but now that he had someone in front of him willing to give himself completely, it was she who had been inaccessible. She was the one who was afraid, and then he understood. I couldn't accept healthy love because I had never known it. For his unconscious, love was not warmth and availability. Love was distance. Love was fighting for attention. Love was uncertainty. It wasn't that Javier was boring or that there was no spark. It was that her mind was programmed to look for what was familiar, not what was good for her. And if I didn't change that, I would keep repeating the same story over and over again. Write a letter to your inner man. Clara looked at the blank sheet in front of her, feeling a deep resistance. Dr. Valera watched her patiently from the other side of the desk. Don't think too much. Just write down the first thing that comes up. Talk to him as if he were a real person. Ask him what you've always wanted to know. Clara swallowed and took the pen. Who are you really? The words came out before he could stop himself. Something inside her stirred. He took a deep breath and continued. All my life I have been looking for you. I have looked for you in every man who has passed through my life. But every time I thought I found you, you disappeared, walked away, or ignored me. Why? What did I do wrong? Suddenly, his hand stopped. Something in his chest tightened. He closed his eyes and, without realizing it, he began to remember. A 6-year-old girl in a dark hallway. On the other side of the half-open door, his father sat in his study, writing, frowning. Dad. Can I come in? The man barely looked up. I'm busy, Clara. Go to your mother. The girl nodded and closed the door carefully. It was the 5th time that week he had received the same response. Clara felt a tightness in her chest. He looked at the paper and, without thinking, wrote the response of his animus. I don't trust you. His hand shook. I don't think you're strong enough. I don't think you can handle me. You always look outside for validation. You always wait for someone else to rescue you. How can I trust you if you don't even trust yourself? The pen fell from his hand. His breathing was labored. All his life, he had believed that they were the problem. The men who didn't value her, those who left her waiting, those who never committed. But at that moment he understood the most painful truth. The problem was never the men. The problem was his relationship with his own animus. The man who lived inside, he was just like his father, critical, distant, distrustful of his ability. How could she find healthy love on the outside if the man inside her rejected her? Clara felt tears on her cheeks. But this time, it wasn't just sadness. They were of clarity. If she wanted to heal her relationship with men, she first had to heal her relationship with her own animus. He took a deep breath. picked up the pen again and wrote with determination, "I'm going to prove you wrong." Clara felt empty. Since the letter to her Animus, something inside her had changed. It was as if he had uncovered a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. He spent the afternoons in his apartment, not wanting to go out, with the feeling that something inside him was breaking, falling apart. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anxiety. Irredual. Dr. Valera had warned. When you realize that your entire life has been based on an unconscious pattern, you feel like something inside you dies. Because, in a sense, that's how it is. Clara understood it now. The woman who sought external validation. The one who believed she had to earn love. The one who saw men as enigmas to be deciphered. That woman was disappearing, and what frightened her the most was that I didn't know who I was without her. That night, Clara dreamed. He was in a dark forest, with fog covering the ground. I walked aimlessly, lost. When she saw a man standing in front of her, his heart raced. It was him. His soul, but not the protective man she had hoped to find. He was cold, with a look of judgment that made her feel small. "You can't change. You will always be the same." Clara felt anger. "No, I'm not the same anymore." And in that moment, he began to transform. His rigid posture relaxed. His face stopped being severe. His eyes, once icy, now reflected something new, trust. For the first time, he didn't look down on her. He looked at her with respect. When she woke up, Clara's heart was racing. I had felt it. His Animus was no longer an enemy. It was changing. And if he changed, it meant she was changing too. He got up, looked in the mirror and said out loud, "External love can only be healthy when you have integrated internal love." For the first time, he believed it. Old me was dying. And in that void, something new was being born. Clara felt different. For the first time in his life, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't scanning every look, every gesture, every word of the men I met, trying to figure out if they were the one. I didn't feel that urgency to be chosen. He didn't feel the need to prove his worth through the love of another. And in that space of tranquility, something new emerged. It happened in the cafeteria where I used to work. It wasn't a date. It wasn't something planned. It was just a spontaneous conversation with Martin. There was no mystery. There were no mind games. Connection only. And the most surprising thing for Clara was that he didn't feel the obsession he had before. With other men, I would have felt anxiety. Will he like me? Why hasn't he written to me? How do I get him to value me more? But with Martin, there was no mental noise. If he responded, good. If not, too, not because he didn't care, but because his self-esteem was no longer at stake in the process. Over time, things with Martin flowed naturally. It was not a love based on need, but on choice. I didn't need to prove anything to him. I didn't feel the need to control him, because I had learned that love, it is not a strategy, it is not a fight. It is not a mystery to solve. Love is a reflection of who you are inside. Watching the sunset from her window, Clara thought about her entire trip, past relationships, emotionally unavailable men, the mourning of his old identity. It had all been part of the process. And then he smiled, because he knew that his story did not end here. It was just the beginning of a more conscious love. Clara was used to associating success with struggle. For as long as he could remember, he had felt that he should demonstrate your worth in every aspect of your life. He had worked tirelessly, trying harder than anyone else, always afraid that if he let his guard down, I would lose everything. But now, something was different. Before, your energy at work came from the need to validation. Now it came from a very different place. Trust. I no longer felt that I should prove which was good enough. He was no longer afraid to ask for what he deserved. She no longer sacrificed her well-being to be recognized. And, to his surprise, Opportunities began to flow easily. For years, the masculine in her life had met oppressive authority. Demanding bosses, the distant men, the structures rigid that seemed crush it. But now, her relationship with masculine energy had changed. He no longer saw authority as a threat, but as a guide. He no longer rejected his ambition, but instead embraced it with pride. He no longer felt like he had to choose between success and his peace of mind, had integrated into itself a healthy animus. One who didn't judge her or push her to the point of exhaustion. One who trusted her and her ability. One afternoon, while reviewing a new project in her office, Clara looked at her reflection in the window and thought, "All my life I believed I had to fight for success and love. But now I know it's not about fighting, it's about alignment." Clara closed her notebook and took a deep breath. It was curious. For so long he had looked outside for answers. In love, in success, in the validation of others. But now I understood something fundamental. The most important relationship in her life was the one she had with herself. That night, he dreamed again. He was in the same forest where I had seen him before. But this time, there was no fog or shadows, and he was there. His soul was no longer the cold and distant man who looked at her with judgment. Now it was serene, confident, present. "Why have you changed?" Clara asked. He smiled slightly. "Because you have changed." Clara woke up with a feeling of calm. He sat at his desk and wrote one last question in his journal. If you looked at your anima or animus today, what face would they have? Have you healed it, or are you still projecting it onto others? Then he looked up and, as if speaking directly to the viewer, said, "Your greatest relationship is with yourself. Love, success, life, everything is a reflection of how you relate to yourself. Are you ready to look within?"